Hey guys, Mr. Stevens back. This is part two this time of our section of guided notes for you virtual guys and anybody looking for a review. So I'm going to start this section with food chains. So you guys should have heard about food chains, maybe a year or two ago in your science classes, or you probably heard about them just, in regular everyday life because we're fortunate enough to live in an area with a lot of different kinds of animals, and we get to see how they interact with each other. I mean, you can go outside and you see how birds and bugs is if you're not careful, snakes sometimes if you're out in the woods, you can see how they interact with their environment and the other animals within that environment. So let's go into this example here. The one on the left, so we have a simple food chain here. We got two examples, so let's look at the one on the left first. So we've got four animals here. We have some oak tree leaves, a caterpillar, a tree creeper, which it's just a little tiny bird, probably around the size of those finches we talked about in the last unit with Darwin down in the Galapagos. And then we've got a hawk. Um, and he is the final section of our food chain here. So over here on the far left with the oak trees, they are labeled as a producer. So a producer is always the first link in our food chains. So that it always starts off with something like a plant or some algae or a type of plankton. Usually always something that is capable of making its own food and performs photosynthesis. So then we move on to the caterpillar. The caterpillar is our primary consumer. This means that he is the first person to eat the producer. So he is the only one of these animals here that directly eats the oak tree leaves. That is why he is the primary consumer. So he's the first one. And then we move on to the tree creeper. And so this little bird, finds the caterpillar hanging out on a tree or a bush or somewhere, and so he eats the caterpillar. That moves on to being the secondary consumer because secondary comes after primary, and he eats the caterpillar, who in turn ate the oak tree leaf, so he is the secondary consumer. And then we move on to the hawk. So the hawks, they like to eat, you know, rodents, snakes, and in this case, smaller birds. So this hawk eats the um, tree creeper, and since he is the secondary consumer, the hawk turns into the tertiary consumer. This means that he is the third individual to eat in our food chain. So you can see here that it takes, effort from the producer. His energy feeds the caterpillar. The caterpillar converts those tree leaves into energy, and he is then eaten by the tree creeper, who takes the nutrients from the caterpillar, and by extension, the oak tree leaves, just to a smaller degree, and he converts that into energy, and then he is eaten by the hawk, who converts the energy from the tree creeper meat that he has consumed into energy for himself. And this whole time he's getting a little bit of energy from the producer. But each link in the food chain reduces the energy that they well, it reduces the energy from the original producer. So each link in the food chain, you lose a little bit of energy from the original source. So our second example here, we've got green algae at the bottom. That's another form of producer. It's just not, the thing we think of. When we think of producer or something that does photosynthesis, it always goes straight to a plant or, a tree or, something like that, something leafy and green. Um, so we've got our producer, and then it goes to the primary consumer again, which in this case is a mollusk. Um, Mollusks are really is a very general term for a lot of different animals that fall in that category. But for our example here, we've got um, like a snail or a slug. Um, this is probably a slug that you could find at the bottom of a creek or a river that's, kind of slowly moving. These guys like to live at the bottom and they'll eat the algae that grows on the rocks or fallen trees that may be down there at the bottom. And then our secondary consumer is the slimy sculpin. Um, I hadn't really heard a lot about these fish before, and I looked it up to get this picture. They're not very big. They live in like small creeks and rivers that aren't moving too fast in North America. And they like to eat the snails and the mollusks and the little things they can find. And then finally we've got our tertiary consumer, the Chinook salmon. And these salmon like to eat fish that are smaller than them, which happens to be the slimy sculpin. They also eat other things, but in our example here, we're just going to use the sculpin. And so, like before, each link in this food chain, the previous animal loses a bit of previous organism, it's not always an animal, but it loses some of the energy that the algae produced. So they have to eat more and more to keep up their body mass, to keep up the energy that they have. So those are a couple of easy examples of food chains. So now we move on to food webs. Food webs are a little bit bigger and more complex than a regular food chain. So a food web is a series of interlocking food chains that shows what eats what in a community. So if we have a big ecosystem, for example, somewhere like the ocean, like we have over here on the right in our picture, there's a lot of little food chains you can see there. So like for example, the plankton at the bottom would be our producer, and that plankton gets eaten by the krill. And then blue whales, despite being so large, they eat something that's almost microscopic. So they eat the krill. And that's really all the blue whale eats. So that's a food chain. But as you can see, uh, squids eat the krill, seagulls eat krill, seals eat the krill. So almost everything on this chart will eat the krill. So we have to take those factors into consideration when we're making our food webs. So we can't just put all these other organisms that eat krill in a big long food chain because a blue whale's not gonna, go out and look for a seagull to eat. That's not really their preferred food because it would be hard to eat enough seagulls in a day to feed a blue whale. They would have a really hard time finding enough seagulls out in their preferred environment to, be able to maintain that size. So we have to include all these other things here, and that's what leads us to have a food web. So we have to include all of the organisms in our area. So here we have a breakdown of producers. So producers are organisms that are capable of making their own food. They are the first step in food webs. They are also referred to as autotrophs. You may not have ever heard the word autotrophs before, but basically an autotroph is something that is capable of making its own food. So a plant is an autotroph. Those plankton down there are an autotroph. The green algae from our previous food chain example, those are autotrophs. Um, the way that I like to remember these is I like to make the comparison with a car. So if you have a automatic car, it shifts gears on its own. You don't have to, have the lever and the clutch, and you don't have to shift gears. So that always just stuck out to me like, okay, an automatic, it shifts the gears for me and I can just keep driving. An autotroph makes its own food, so they're just surviving without having to go around and eat. Um, that's just the way that I like to remember it. So let's go to consumers. Consumers are organisms that are required to consume food in order to obtain their energy. They are often referred to as primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. They are also referred to as heterotrophs. So if we just said that autotrophs are organisms that are capable of making their own food, what do you guys think a heterotroph is? Well, if you said a organism that has to eat food manually, you would be correct. So all of these organisms, other than a plankton in our food web over here on the right, they are examples of heterotrophs because the penguin has to go out and hunt for those plankton to eat. The seals have to go hunt for penguins, and the squids have to go hunt for seals. They have to go out and, physically find these things and eat them and digest them to get energy. They can't just, sit there and let the sun shine on them and drink a little bit of water and be okay. So that's the big difference between producers and consumers and autotrophs and heterotrophs. So now we have a special case here. We have decomposers. Decomposers are special organisms that are required for an ecosystem to remain healthy. Decomposers break down organic material from dead organisms and release those minerals back into the soil. So, if we didn't have decomposers, uh, there would be a lot of dead trees, dead animals, animal waste, just all kinds of gross, smelly things laying around all over the place. And there would be no way to get rid of them short of just collecting them all and burning them or, some other drastic measure of getting rid of these things. So luckily we have decomposers like mushrooms here, like in the picture, to do that for us. They break down all these minerals that are useful to us and put them back in the soil so that plants can take them and be able to grow healthy. And, eventually do perform photosynthesis and give us oxygen so that we can be healthy. So, like Mufasa said in the movie, it's a circle of life, and it requires these mushrooms doing the dirty work of, breaking down the dead things to keep that circle going. And, like it says there, the most common type of decomposer, especially in a forested area, are fungi, which are fungus, which are mushrooms. So here we've got another example of a food web and a food chain. You can see how complex the food web is in comparison to the food chain. But if you notice, they all start with a plant of some kind, whether it's grass or berries or a plantain. Um, all of those things start from there. And, we've got the small little things like the grasshoppers, the green flies, and the rabbits, and those lead on into the various food chains and then interconnect themselves and make a food web. This is another easy example. You guys can kind of trace the lines and see where they go, and you can see how complex things are. And you can pick out the so-called apex predators in the food webs of, the the buzzard, for example. Nothing really attacks the buzzard and eats it on our food web, and same for the fox. They are the final links in the food web. So we've got another section here for let's practice. This video goes to a website called Khan Academy. You may have used them before. It's a very helpful resource. I still use them now whenever I'm in college learning stuff. It's very helpful. This video will ask you guys to pick out some producers and consumers and secondary consumers, and just give you a little bit of practice. Their website has very good articles if you would like to read a little bit more about this, or if you want to study it. They've got some very good stuff there, but be careful because a lot of it will go a lot more in depth than you're going to want to for this unit, and I don't want you guys to get confused about topics that we're not ready to discuss yet. So I'm going to cut this part here. So we've got our food chains and our food webs. Um, so I'll see you guys in the next part when we get ready to finish up these notes, hopefully.